OPEC and its allies, including Russia, are due to meet on Wednesday. Sources have told Reuters the group will stick to plans to add 400,000 barrels a day to the market from April. Well, for more, I'm now joined by Homayoun Falakshahi, senior commodity analyst at Kepler. Homayoun, hi. Now, the West has so far spared much of the energy sector because it's so necessary, of course, to Europe. But are the sanctions that we see now going to start to bite on Russia's oil and gas exports?
Hi, Elena. Thanks for having me. Yes, indeed. I think on one side, Russia is so important to the global commodity markets that it's obvious that the Western countries and the world in general cannot impose sanctions as easily as, say, they imposed them on Iran. However, on the other side, it seems that some of these countries are really serious in going hard on Russia. And although so far we haven't seen any impact of these really recent sanctions on Russia on commodity markets. So we've seen oil exports continue as normal. We've seen LNG exports continue as normal. However, we are hearing that some importers are saying that they will, stop from importing or restrain from importing Russian crude or LNG in the next few days. Now, it's unclear how long this will last, but we do expect some, physical flows to be hit in the short term, for sure.
What would you then expect the impact of that supply crunch in Europe to be on global markets? Where else is Europe going to be able to supply itself?
Well, as you probably know, Europe is very dependent on Russia. It takes about a third of its imported oil from there. It takes about 40% of its gas from Russia. Similarly, it takes a lot of petroleum products from Russia, fuel oil, diesel, gasoline and jet fuel as well. So it really depends on what markets you're looking at. I think that for most of these markets, it is going to be very complicated for Europe to be able to get supply from elsewhere, at least at the same economic conditions. So definitely, I think we should expect higher prices in a lot of commodity markets if we indeed see physical flows being affected by the current wave of sanctions. And it really depends again on what sort of markets you're looking at. I think that, for example, on the oil market side, the crude market side, it would be relatively easier compared to the gas market. So Europe could turn, especially to Middle Eastern providers, countries such as Saudi Arabia and UAE. We have seen OPEC plus exports increase this month so far in February, especially from the likes of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So Europe can turn to these places. However, when it comes to natural gas, I think there is basically no short-term solution, even though we are seeing record levels of US LNG going into Europe. I don't think that if we see full stop in Russian exports, probably Europe won't be able to make up losses for these volumes in the short term.
OPEC Plus meets this week, of course, with Russia being a key member. Generally, the group tries to avoid politics, but that's quite difficult at the moment. So where does this volatile situation leave OPEC Plus?
Yeah, so OPEC Plus, as you said, is in a very strange situation because Russia is part of it. And at the same time, over the past 2 years, we have seen important members, forge some strong ties with Russia, especially Saudi Arabia. So as you said, they usually try to put politics aside in the decision making, and I think that they're likely going to be doing so at least at this meeting, even though it's going to be tough. But they're going to use the argument that physical markets so far are not impacted. In fact, as I told you earlier, they increased exports this month by about 1.2 million barrels per day, which is a very big number, even though that follows 2 weaker months in December and January, where we actually saw exports decrease by a total of 700 KBD. So that kind of already has helped ease a very tight oil market so far. And I think that generally saying also, the group's ability to hike production in a very short time frame, if you put aside countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that's very limited for other countries. So I think that in the very short term, they're likely to keep their decision to go on with the 400,000 barrels per day hike in production. And they basically will leave the tough decision to be taken for next month's meeting. So let's not forget that they meet in just 4 weeks' time. And between then, you can have some other sort of downward pressure on prices if the situation comes down around Ukraine, if you get an SPR release or if you get an Iran deal this week.
Can I briefly ask you about that, Homayoun? Are analysts still expecting an Iran deal could happen this week, and could that depress the price despite everything that's happening in Ukraine?
So I think obviously it's very tough to say. It seems that there are some very key issues that there are still stumbling blocks here. So it still sounds that it's like 50-50. But I think that we got closer to an Iran deal, and the fact that the West seems to go very hard on Russia in terms of sanctions and seems to be willing to limit to an extent their energy exports. That includes crude oil. An Iran deal will actually help the oil market in terms of supply, and the impact on prices. Yes, I think so. So I think a full Iran deal is not yet priced in global oil prices, and so we think that so if they reach a deal where they allow Iran to be able to export crude oil relatively freely in the next few weeks, then we think that this could weigh on prices by about 5 to 10% in the very short term, maybe 5% on the same day, and up to 10% in the next few days. But as you said, the fundamentals remained relatively bullish on the market, even leaving aside the geopolitical risk premium that is factored in right now. So on the longer run, we remain bullish on prices, even though in the very short term, you can have some events such as this one or the SPR release that could factor on prices. And just finishing on Iran, in terms of production, we think that Iran can increase production by about 1 million barrels per day in 3 months, and a total of 1.3 million barrels per day in about 6 months' time. And on the other side, they also have a lot of oil in floating storage that they could use to unleash to the oil market in a very short time frame.
Thanks so much for that insight, Homayoun Falakshahi, Senior Commodity Analyst at Kepler.